The forest stretched endlessly before me, a vast expanse of towering trees that seemed to swallow up the sunlight, leaving only dappled shadows dancing on the forest floor. It was deep into autumn, and the leaves were a riot of fiery hues, crunching softly beneath my boots as I ventured deeper into the wilderness. My backpack was heavy with supplies, but I welcomed the weight, a comforting reminder of civilization in an otherwise untamed landscape. As the day wore on, the sky grew heavy with ominous clouds, and a chill wind began to whistle through the trees. I quickened my pace, seeking shelter before the storm hit, and that's when I saw it. A weather-beaten cabin nestled among the trees, its windows dark and its roof sagging with neglect. Relief flooded through me as I approached, the promise of warmth and shelter too tempting to resist. The door groaned open on rusty hinges, revealing a dim interior illuminated only by the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The air inside was musty and thick with the scent of damp wood, but I welcomed it gratefully, stripping off my sodden jacket and rubbing my chilled hands together. As I explored the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sense that I was not alone in this remote corner of the wilderness. Night fell quickly, the storm raging outside with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. I huddled close to the fire, its flickering flames casting long shadows that danced eerily across the walls. Every creak of the old timbers made my heart race, every howl of the wind sending shivers down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm abated, leaving behind an oppressive silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. I should have felt relief, but instead a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. As I lay in bed, listening to the quiet whispers of the forest outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. And then, just as I was on the verge of sleep, I heard it, a soft, insistent tapping at the window, like long fingernails scratching against the glass. My blood ran cold as I lay there in the darkness, paralyzed with fear. And then, with a suddenness that took my breath away, the tapping stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the forest itself. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move, too terrified even to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the noise ceased, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to press down on me like a physical weight. Morning came, but I dared not leave the safety of the cabin, too afraid of what might be waiting for me outside. And so I waited, trapped in that lonely cabin in the deep woods, haunted by the memory of that terrible night and the sinister presence that lurked just beyond the edge of the forest. The dense forest stretched endlessly before me, towering trees that seemed to whisper secrets as the wind rustled through their branches. Lost in the depths of the wilderness, I stumbled upon the old cabin by chance, its weathered timbers barely visible through the thick undergrowth. As I approached, a sense of foreboding washed over me, a primal instinct warning me to turn back before it was too late. But the night was drawing in, and the promise of shelter was too tempting to resist. With a deep breath, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside, the musty scent of decay mingling with the damp earth. The interior of the cabin was bathed in a dim, flickering light, cast by a handful of candles that lined the walls. Shadows danced in the corners, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to watch my every move. Unease settled over me like a heavy blanket as I took in the scene before me, a gathering of robed figures, their faces obscured by hoods, their hands raised in silent supplication. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I had stumbled upon a cult, their unholy rites unfolding before my very eyes. Fear rooted me to the spot as I watched, unable to tear my gaze away from the spectacle unfolding before me. Symbols of unspeakable horror adorned the walls, their meaning lost to the passage of time, but their malevolent aura unmistakable. As the night wore on, the cultists grew increasingly frenzied, their chants rising to a fevered pitch that echoed through the cramped confines of the cabin. Desperation clawed at my chest as I searched for a means of escape, but every door and window was sealed tight, as if mocking my futile attempts to flee. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting ceased, replaced by a deathly silence that sent a chill down my spine. With bated breath, I watched as the cultists turned their hooded faces towards me, their eyes burning with an unholy fervor that made my blood run cold. "Welcome, brother," one of them hissed, their voice a guttural rasp that sent shivers down my spine. "You have been chosen to join us in our sacred rites." With horror, I realized the truth. I was to be their latest sacrifice, a pawn in their twisted games of worship and devotion. With nowhere left to run, I stood frozen in terror as they advanced, their hands outstretched like claws reaching for prey. But just as they closed in on me, a deafening roar shattered the silence, followed by the sound of splintering wood as the cabin was ripped apart by an unseen force. In the chaos that ensued, I felt myself lifted from the ground, carried away on a tide of swirling darkness that swallowed the cabin whole. When I awoke, I found myself lying on the forest floor, battered and bruised but miraculously alive. The cabin was nowhere to be seen, as if it had never existed at all. With trembling hands, I stumbled back onto the path, haunted by the memory of the horrors I had witnessed and the narrow escape from a fate worse than death. And as I fled deeper into the forest, I knew that the nightmare was far from over, for the cult still lurked in the shadows, waiting to claim their next victim. The dense wilderness seemed to swallow me whole as I stumbled upon the cabin nestled deep within its tangled embrace. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to grasp at the sky. Despite the sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, the encroaching darkness of the night urged me forward, seeking refuge from the biting chill that gnawed at my bones. With each cautious step, the looming shadows seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around me like a suffocating embrace, whispering secrets of forgotten horrors. Pushing open the creaking door, I entered the dimly lit interior, the musty scent of neglect assaulting my senses. The room was barren, save for a few pieces of tattered furniture and the faint glow of moonlight filtering through grimy windows. But my attention was drawn to the far corner, where a solitary figure lay huddled on the cold, hard floor, a homeless man, his threadbare clothes offering little protection against the biting cold. As I approached, his eyes flickered open, revealing a glimmer of recognition that sparked within their depths. His voice, hoarse and strained, croaked out a greeting, his gratitude palpable as he welcomed me into his humble abode. With a heavy heart, I offered him what little food and warmth I had, hoping to provide some solace in the face of his suffering. But as the night wore on, his demeanor began to change, his movements growing more erratic and unpredictable with each passing moment. It soon became clear that he was under the influence of some powerful drug, his mind lost in the swirling depths of its intoxicating embrace. Fear crept into the corners of my mind as I watched him spiral further into madness, his eyes vacant and distant, his words a jumbled mess of incoherent ramblings. Desperate to escape the suffocating confines of the cabin, I made to leave, but before I could reach the safety of the door, he lunged at me with a frenzied fervor, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Adrenaline surged through my veins as I fought to fend him off, his grip like a vice as he clawed at me with wild abandon. With a final burst of strength, I broke free from his grasp, stumbling out into the cold embrace of the night with a sense of relief and dread intertwining within me. The forest loomed ominously around me as I fled, the sound of his deranged laughter echoing in my ears long after I had escaped his clutches. As I emerged from the depths of the woods, battered and bruised but alive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the pit of my stomach. The memory of that night would haunt me for years to come, a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the darkness and the fragility of the human mind in the face of despair. And though I had escaped the clutches of the madman, I knew that the horrors of that night would forever be etched into my soul, a chilling testament to the darkness that dwells within us all.